Hi, International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley here, and today we will take a look at the Maroczy bind. This is the third part of our three-part webinar series on the Ron Henley iChess.net master method. Well, seems like my camera's not working, so let's go ahead and go to the application window and pull up some chess-based files and just move on to the chess, because after all, you really came to learn about chess, not to look at my picture. Let's take a look. So e4. First off, we want to get the proper perspective, so let's go ahead and flip the board and look from the black side. After e4, c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, and g6. Of course, g6 is what we call the hyper-accelerated. You can also play knight c6. And after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6, and c4 would lead us to the Maroczy bind. Now, needless to say, there are quite a number of ways you could get to the Maroczy bind. Some games start with knight f3, or white starts with an English and backs into a Maroczy bind. Now, one thing to note about the two knight c6 move order is you do need to be prepared to meet 3 bishop to b5, the Rossolimo variation, and I will be covering that in some upcoming anti-Sicilian DVDs. But for the moment, we want to reach our main Maroczy bind type position, and we're going to focus on g6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Now, let's see. One thing I do want to do here is I want to go ahead and be able to see the chats so we can have a little interaction with people chatting. Okay, so after knight takes d4. Now notice one of the unique ways that white can try to take advantage of our hyper-accelerated move order is to play queen takes d4 and hit our unprotected rook in the corner. We do cover that in the master method. But after the usual knight takes d4, bishop g7, c4, okay, give me 1 second while I'm going to try to go back into YouTube and get the live stream so that I can have a little access to the chats and be able to communicate with everyone. Let's see. Okay, that's not quite right. Just bear with me 1 second here. Okay, I want to make sure that's on mute. I want to get on down here. Okay, so it looks like R squared is here, Adnan is here, says hello, Sean Gao is at the first one, and Parth Kanani. I'd absolutely appreciate all of you guys showing up, and more than anything, I appreciate your patience with my technological technophobe shortcomings. I assure you that I will eventually overcome these challenges, and let's continue on. So after c4, you can see white grips the light squares, the Maroczy bind. We cover this in some depth, and we give you a repertoire. Now, great players, world champions, Lasker, Capablanca, Erva, and Rubinstein have played this with white, but also world champions that love space, like Botvinnik, Petrosian, and Karpov have played with white. But theoreticians, and including world champion Spassky, Geller, Tukmakov, Albert, a number of players have been willing to play the black side, including Americans, Bobby Fischer and Walter Brown. So, one of the things we do in our historical part of the master method is we cover some of those great games from those great players and their experiences in the Maroczy bind. Michael Kopchuk says hello. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Sounds very Russian. Okay. So, Let's take a look. Knight c6 challenges the knight on d4. Bishop e3 protects the knight. Knight f6. Knight to c3. Now note a beginner mistake here is to try and play knight takes, pawn takes, and e5. However, this is a typical trap. Queen a5 check, double attack, wins a pawn, and queen takes e5. More than one beginner has fallen into that. But after knight f6, the correct move, of course, is knight to c6. Now, normal play in a Maroczy bind would continue with something like d6. The system that we're going to look at, and we're going to base our repertoire on, is a very old system from the 1930s called the Breyer variation. You play the simplifying knight to g4. And in some ways, this is actually pretty logical. The knight hawk seeks to combat the space advantage by using pressure against the white bishop on e3 and the knight on d4 to force the exchange of some pieces. And this was first played by the talented Hungarian grandmaster Gyula Breyer. Okay. And from black's point of view, since white does have more space, as Roman Jinjin-Hashvili has talked about, black wants to exchange at least two pairs of minor pieces. That way his remaining pieces have more room to move about. Okay, so queen takes g4, of course, is the main line. That's what you will see most of the time. However, in the early days when this was first played in the 1930s, players would play knight takes c6. But after knight takes c3, knight takes d8, and knight takes d1, you get this queenless type middle game where black has the two bishops. Yes, white has a little more space, but the two bishops in the long run offer black pretty good winning chances. Now, of course, theoretically, this is not a challenging way for white to play. In fact, I already prefer black. But nonetheless, unprepared white players today still play this way because they're looking for some way to kind of bail out because they're in unfamiliar territory. However, after queen takes g4, we now play knight takes on d4. Okay, so once we play knight takes d4, of course, we're threatening the fork on c2. Now here, JK says, hey, JK. Okay, so queen d1 is far and away the main line. Covers the knight fork on c2, threatens the knight on d4. However, in the master method, we also cover castle's queenside. And there have been a few games played like this. In fact, I think there was one crazy game where Eddie Gufeld played d5, exposing on the queen. e5, of course, is a move. And instead of queen d1, also rarely played and probably not really good for white, is bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then I already have a slight preference. Now that said, this was actually seen in a women's Olympiad game where Pia Kramling, the Swedish woman star, won a nice game with black. I believe that's covered in the master method as well. But after queen d1, the main line, and now you could play knight back to c6, but that's just tame and lame. Knight e6 has been seen in many, many games, but the variation we're going to recommend, very enterprising, is e5. Now, when I learned chess in some of my formative years, Karpov had a lot of prominence and pawn weaknesses were kind of abhorred. However, now more modern day theory with computers looks at the dynamic counterplay that you get when you take on pawn weaknesses. And as Fisher said, to get squares, you have to give up squares. I never paid much attention to the e5 advance before because of the weaknesses on d5 and d6 and the potential isolated weak pawn here if this knight gets captured. However, with the ability of computers to run our calculations much deeper, we can now see that this type of dynamic play is more in vogue and more acceptable. So after e5, which is what we're going to recommend, and I believe this variation to be fully sound, and not just myself, you're in good company here. Players like Garry Kasparov played this in the quarterfinals of the World Championship to make a quick draw with a very theoretical player, Zoltan Ribli. Okay, so obviously he had prepared. Botvinnik, his mentor, also played this. So let's take a look. Now, white's most theoretical move is to play knight to b5 if he really wants to try and refute our system. Of course, he could play other tamer moves like bishop to e2, moves like bishop to d3. All of these moves have been played, but they just kind of like admit that they're going to kind of like sit there with the knight and kind of work around the knight. Okay, so knight to b5 is considered far and away the sharpest. Now, in the Master Method series, we cover I.M. Pajwani's d6 recommendation. His argument for playing d6, as opposed to castles, which is the most popular move and has been played many times, much more frequently. His argument is that castles is, by and of itself, a somewhat passive or defensive move, okay? And Lombardi, in a book he wrote, also talks about how castles should be kind of the last thing you look to do in some respects. And of course, in sniper books, I talk about delayed castling, okay? But after knight to b5, this is considered white's sharpest. He's simply immediately contesting. And what we're going to look at today is castles, which is the main line. And here the most popular has been queen to d2. White starts thinking about castling queenside, and there we're going to recommend in our master method, playing like Gary Kasparov, he played queen e7. And that game petered out into a draw, and analysis shows that black was very close to equal. Now, that said, there were some crazy games where the players playing black played queen to h4. And it's good to be aware of those tactics, even if they're not exactly 1000% correct, but because themes tend to come up from different variations. But what we're going to look at today is after castles, suppose white takes the pawn on d4. And after castles, to be honest, there are not that many top-level master games because most of your 2,700 players, they have this sense of danger, and they're a little leery about capturing a pawn and giving black an initiative. But down at the club level, I have to say there's more than one player that will probably grab that pawn and just think you simply, made a mistake, didn't know what you were doing, hung a pawn. And I realized that after knight takes d4, e takes d4, bishop takes d4, in our master method, I didn't really particularly cover in depth what to do if white grabs that pawn. But let's take a look. What I did talk about in the master method is the interrelationship and the different elements in chess. There's material, which is one of the first things we all learn about when we first learn chess. And here you can see from a material point of view that white has an extra pawn, 7 to 6. But there's also king safety. And if we look at the relative king safety, we can see this black king is nice and snug, castled at home. This king still in the center of the board. Well, let's see how this plays out. So here you have a classic example of material versus king safety and development. Well, first off, black can play queen a5 check. King e2 is pretty much forced. Very easily, we can see that queen d2 simply loses a piece that takes. Bishop c3 is probably just about as bad. After queen check, the king has to move up anyway. And then rook e8 is already a 3-point advantage for black. So after queen a5 check, king e2 is forced. Now comes rook e8, simply threatening to capture the pawn on e4 with check. Okay. Now there's about 6 games that I found where players with white played pawn to f3, trying to cement the extra pawn. But let's take a look. Bishop takes g7, rook e4 check, king f3, queen f5 check, and checkmate. Okay, let's take another look. Bishop takes g7, rook takes check, suppose the king goes to d3. Well, then you have queen f5, pawn to g4, and rook takes g4 check, and then simply king takes g7. You've recovered your pawn, but clearly the white king is much more exposed. So after rook e8, as I said, about 6 games continued with pawn to f3. But then comes the fantastic shot d5. And this is why you need to kind of be a little bit aware of exactly how you're going to get your compensation if you offer a pawn like this. If you let white just make a few moves and consolidate his extra pawn, you'll be wondering why you're playing this opening. Okay? In fact, you'll probably be calling iChess and saying you want a refund on the video. Okay. Anyway, after d5, this, of course, is a thematic blast in the Accelerated Dragon, in pretty much all Sicilians, but especially in the Accelerated Dragon. When you're ahead in development, their king is in the center. You want to blast the center open to get to him. Now, here they can play bishop takes on g4, on g7. And there have been a handful of games that happen like this. Does anyone know what the shot would be now for black? How should black continue from this position? Okay, so if you saw rook takes c4 check, mad props for tactics. Okay, so it looks to me like there's a handful of people here. Okay, so I see Parth, I see Michael, I see Sean Gao, and I see Adnan. Does anyone see what the tactic here is? So after rook takes e4 check, well, first off, after rook e4 check, there's king f2. That's been played a few games. Note that f takes e4, of course, allows bishop to g4 check. Now, white does collect a bit of material, but the evaluation is still 2.5 in black's favor. After king f2, there have been a handful of games. Queen c5 check. You could also play queen b6 check. And after king g3, the key move is queen to e3, which would transpose. So after king g3, we're going to take a look at a couple of games. Queen e3. Now the threat when you play queen e3 is to play rook g4 check. On king h3, you then have rook g5 check. Little discovered check, laser beam from the bishop on c8, pawn to g4. Of course, if king h4, you have check and very quick mate. G4, bishop takes g4 check. King over, bishop check, and checkmate. Now, we're going to look at the game Bettina Treibert, 2300 against Henrik Teskey, 2500. After queen e3, white played h3. Of course, this guards the g4 square and stops the rook g4 check. But then came queen f4 check, king f2, king takes g7. And to demonstrate the theoretical adequacy, of course, of the opening, you could just simply take a draw. But on the other hand, when you have their king on the march, why would you want to take a draw? So after king g7, you recover your bishop. He can't take your rook because his pawn is pinned. And then on queen c1, offering to trade queens, well, of course, if cd5, just simply bishop d7, the other rook comes into the game, black's doing great. He's got fantastic compensation for the pawn. In the game, queen c1 offered to trade queens. But then came queen check, king back, and rook back to e5. Notice that if g3, you simply play queen f6. Pawn takes, bishop out, queen to c3, and rook to d4 with a very, very powerful game for the black team. In the game, king g1 happened. But then came rook e5. Pawn takes, and queen d4 check, king h2, rook takes d5. Black got his pawn back, still has a safer queen. White decided to secure the king by trading queens, but after queen takes, pawn takes, white has inferior pawn structure. And notice also, one of the things that I always look at is we have a 2 rook and bishop versus 2 rook and bishop ending. After bishop f5, bishop c4, rook c5, black's already going to win a pawn and is clearly better. Now, I see we have a few more people here joined us on the chat. I see Jason's here, Sarah's here, Sean Gao talks about a skewer, and someone was recommending bishop to g4. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look. I think black did a really good job in this endgame. See what you think. After bishop b3, took the pawn on c3, rook over, rook down, hoping to get a little 7th rank counterplay, but black was there, ready. And on rook at e1, very nice, king back to f8, evicting the rook. Okay, so the rook dropped back to e5, bishop came to d7, bishop to d5, and rook to e8. Excellent play, forcing the exchange of one pair of rooks. Okay, yes, and Thinkosi is here. Excellent. Okay, so bishop takes. Now black has a solid extra pawn, 2-to-1 queenside majority. Rook over, and I like what black did here. Instead of just b6, played b5, gets the pawn majority going. Well, then came rook back to the e file, pawn to a5, and pawn to a4, just pushing those little babies up the board. Kicking the bishop, the king comes out, bishop comes out. Now this actually sets a little trap. White played g4. But if bishop takes f7, of course you don't play king f7 and let the rook in. No. After bishop f7, you have the nice little shot, rook f5 check, and you collect the bishop that way. So in the game, white played g4, trying to sneak in bishop takes f7. But then came f6, h6, g5, fixing those pawns over there on that side, and king up, and now bishop e6. Now normally you would want to trade rooks and not bishops because the bishop ending should be easier to win with an extra pawn. But in this case, black reasoned the only way to make progress was to go ahead and exchange off the bishops. So let's see what happened. Bishop takes, and now you have a pure rook ending 4 versus 3. Rook to d8, rook check, king up, rook check, check, and then very nice play, rook to b2. Now we can see the advantage of having advanced these pawns is that they are qualitative superior. That means that these pawns are more valuable than, say, the a2 pawn, for example, because they're already very, very close to promotion. This is a key in-game technique. After rook b6, a3, continuing the thought, and believe it or not, even though black is only 1 pawn ahead, the evaluation is actually -4, basically saying white is toast. After king d3, rook takes a2, and this is what's really nice. Lets him take this pawn with check, lets him check and pick off another pawn, but then, again, we talk about qualitative superiority. It's now 2-to-2, but after rook a1, this pawn is 2 squares from promotion. King c2, and then rook over to f1, rook to a6, a2, and white resigned. After a2, you simply check, trade rooks, and then you can see the white king is far, far away. It's not going to be a close contest at all. The black king boxes him out, and very nice. Okay, so let's go back to our key position after rook takes e4. The next game we'll look at is Alexander Milosevic, 2269, versus Zoran Novalevsky, 2300. This was played in Serbia, 2016. So again, this is why I love this accelerated dragon, and I like this knight G4 Breyer variation, because a 2200 player in Serbia in 2016 walks into the soup. So it shows unprepared white players can definitely get in trouble. So after rook e4, we have another game here where king f2 is played. Well, then came queen c5 check, king g3, and the excellent queen to e3. Well, h3 happened again, queen f4 check, king f2, and king takes g7. Black is already better. Again, if c takes d4, bishop d7, something like this could happen, and black stands well. If queen takes on d5 in this situation, well, you have queen e3 check, and then very nice rook to e5. After queen a5 check, king f2, rook d2 check, queen check, and rook takes b2. Black's not even a pawn down and just simply has tremendous position. So going back to the game, after king takes g7, queen c1, queen went back to f6, and the evaluation here is about 0.7 for black. After queen c3, pawn to d4, queen to d2, bishop to d7 exclamation point, preparing total mobilization, while white's still trying to untangle his king side. After king g1, rook f4, rook e1, bishop c6, queen f2, and then rook d8. So on a relative value basis, we can see the black army totally mobilized. He's got a passed pawn on d4. Things are going great. After bishop to d3, bishop takes f3, exclamation point. A nice bishop sacrifice to shatter the king cover around the white pawn. Well, white played rook f1, trying to take advantage of the pin along the file. Notice that capturing the bishop would just get crushed because rook takes, queen e2, and now the nice deflection, rook sacrifice, rook e8. On queen e8, you have queen g5 check, king h2, and rook f2 mate. I guess if you prefer, you have queen g3 mate there as well. Going back, if you try to take the bishop, rook takes. If you go queen to d2, that covers the g5 check and avoids the rook e8 smack. But then you have rook g3 check. And rook takes d3. Very nice shot, because on queen d3, you have queen f2 mate. So a very powerful crushing bishop sacrifice here with bishop takes f3. We can see why white tried to exploit the pin, but then came queen g5. Pinning the white g-pawn looks attractive, and of course this actually worked out nicely for black in the game, but white now missed a very clever opportunity to save himself with queen d2. Note the counterpin on this rook. After queen g3, he could play queen back to f2. And then on queen back to g5, note queen f2, rook f2, bishop e4. This just kind of leaves black with compensation, but not a lot more. So after queen d2, queen g3, queen d2, white could actually bail out and save the draw. In the game, though, Milicevic, the 2269 player, missed the moment and didn't find queen d2. Instead, played king h2, double question mark. And then came bishop c6, exclamation point, winning position. Because after queen g3, simply traded queens. Note that queen f4, of course, would have allowed queen takes g2 checkmate. After bishop c6, queen g3, then came queen g3 check, king g3, rook f1, and again we have a rook and bishop versus rook and bishop ending where black is a solid pawn ahead. But it's good to go ahead and appreciate the technique of good players. f5, b4, pawn to b6, king f2, and now interesting move bishop e4. Again, offering to trade bishops, but in this scenario, a trade of bishops would give black connected past center pawns. Nonetheless, probably black's best chance to save the game, white's best chance. But after rook d1, king f6, and king e5. We can see black totally dominates in the center. Okay, so after rook c1, trying to get his rook behind his own passed pawn, then came the excellent play d3. On king e3, very nice heads-up play, d2, ramming the pawn in, and on rook d1, f4 check, pushing the king back. On king e2, a little pit stop with bishop d3 check, king f2, and note that king d2 would allow bishop takes f1 check, simply winning material. And after king f2, simply bishop c2, overpowering the rook, and white resigned. So there you can see, 2016, a 2269 FIDE rated player just getting crushed with the white pieces. Now, we have one more example here of the king going to f2. This is Balázs Zuk, 2388 versus Adam Popovic, 2421. This was from the Hungarian Team Championship in 2004. Again, we get to this position with rook takes e4 check. As we mentioned, pawn takes simply allows bishop to g4 check. So after rook e4 check, king f2. Well, one more time, queen c5 check, king g3, and then the excellent move, queen to e3. Again, this is the kind of move that it's good to know beforehand, so you're not having to find it over the board. Again, white played h3, queen f4 check, king f2, and king takes g7. And as we said before, black's already about 0.70 better. Queen c1, queen f6, queen c3, d4, queen d2, and bishop d7. Rook d1, bishop c6, king g3, queen e5 check, queen d6 check was worth considering. On queen e5 check, king f2, and then rook f4, bishop d3. And here, black played rook e8. And after rook at d1, queen to g5, white played rook e2, black exchanged, and then played rook f6. Although here, queen h4 check was good. On g3, then you have the shot, rook takes f3 check. Very nice, because on queen f3, bishop takes f3. When he takes your queen, you recoup the rook, minus 2.30, a winning bishop versus bishop ending for black. So this is really the moment where black missed queen h4 check to really capitalize on his initiative. If the king has to drop back, that leaves the rook over here stranded in the corner. No question, black would be better. But instead, after rook f6, then came rook to d1. Rook over, e6 would have still kept a slight edge, but after rook over, queen d2, and miraculously, white has managed to hold his position together and equalize. Now, white here should kind of bail out, play queen back to f6, protect his pawn on d4. The game would probably end in a draw. Instead, under the illusion that he still had some advantage, black played rook e3 and began to overextend himself. Does anyone see the tactic for white that turned the game in his favor? I see a lot of people are here, but okay, so the move that turned things in white's favor here was bishop to e4. An excellent interference and exposing the fragility of the pawn on d4. So after being under pressure since grabbing the pawn out of the opening, white rises to the occasion and makes the most. And as JK points out, bishop e4 threatens queen d4 check and the rook. So the rook is stranded. In fact, this totally turned the game in white's favor. After queen h4 check, pawn to g3, black actually resigned. After g3, simply queen h3, queen check, f6, king takes e3, and doesn't really have too much to show for being a rook down. So now let's go back to our key position after rook takes e4. And I think we mentioned that aside from pawn takes, which simply loses the queen to bishop g4 check, and king f2, the other option for white is to play king to d3. So there have actually been a handful of games there. We have U. Kirsten, 2342, against Klaus Jurgen, 2140. So this is interesting. You have a player playing black, rated 200 points lower. This is in Dresden, 2004. Rook e4, king d3 check. Well, now, what do you do for black? You haven't recouped your bishop on d4. Your rook on e4 is actually hanging. You play rook takes c4, exclamation point. Now king e3 has been played a few games, and then queen c5 check. When the bishop comes back to d4, queen e7 check. And the point being, after king f4, you now have queen h4 check. I guess we should make it a little T-note there that if the king had gone back to e2, you have queen check. And what this does is it's a double hit on the bishop, so you threaten to recoup your piece. So at minimum, you could have a draw with something like this. So after king f4, queen h4 check, g4, king e3, you also have, after g4, king e3 probably would be a better choice. After queen h4 check, white played g4 in this game. But then came bishop takes g4. Bishop takes c4. Note, if he takes this guy, you have the nice shot queen f2 check due to the pin on the bishop. On king g5, you have h6 check, sucking that king forward, and queen h4 checkmate. Going back after f takes g4, queen check, of course king e5, rook e8 check, king d5, rook d4, rook check, and this is just going to be mate in a few moves. Okay. So let's go back after king f4. Check, b4, bishop takes, and now very nice play, bishop f5 check. Well, I think we can readily see that if the king goes to e5, that's just very dangerous. You go rook e8 check, queen back check, queen over check, and queen over checkmate. So let's go back after bishop takes g4, bishop takes on c4. The actual game continued with bishop check. King tried to run and hide, but then came rook check, bishop e5, rook check, king back, queen f4 check. Well played. King went to c3, and then came rook e3 check. Although I think actually queen takes on c4 was probably a little quicker. The wrap-up would have been something like this. But nonetheless, he got the job done with rook e5, king d2, queen f4 check, king c3, and rook e3 check also brought about resignation. After rook e3 check, the finish would be bishop d3, queen check, and then again, you would come to kind of the same position that we looked at before, but a very nice touch with rook c3, pawn takes, check, and check. So there you can see quite a few FIDE-rated players, rated master and higher, have fallen into this. Our next game, we'll see a game after rook e4 check, king d3. This is a game Evgeny Rogozin, 2489. Almost 2,500 fell into this. He's playing Miroslav Majewski, rated 2330. This was in Poland, 2003. So some serious FIDE-rated players. Well, black knew his stuff and played rook takes c4, and on king e3 played queen c5 check, bishop to d4, queen e7 check, king f2, queen h4 check, king e3, and now, rather than just simply repeat moves with queen e7 check, the player playing black, playing a player rated 150 points higher than him, said, no, 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 no. We're not letting that king off the hook. Let's go for mobilization, development, bishop f5. This threatened simply rook e8 check, prying him away from the bishop. After pawn to g4, well, of course, bishop c4, rook e8 check is just lights out. You can imagine the finish is very similar to what we saw in the previous game. And so after bishop f5, double exclamation point, g4, then came rook e8 check, king f4, g5 check. The white king is caught in a mating net, and white resigned. After g5 check, king f5, very nice, queen h6, bishop takes c4, and queen g6 mate. So absolutely amazing. A 2489 FIDE rated player losing in 22 moves with white in the supposedly nice, safe Maroczy bind. We have Michael and Penny saying, hi, Earthlings. Hello, hello, hello. Now, we've had other players come walk into the soup. After rook e4 check, king d3. Our next game is Grandmaster Lucas Brunner, 25-25. He's playing an IM, Roland Ekstrom, good Swedish player. This was in Switzerland, 1990. So one thing, who was it said something about those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it? You can see games 14, 15, 20 years apart, same variation. So that's why it's good to be prepared. So after king d3, again, the question is, what does black do? The rook is now threatened for real, and he threatens to save his bishop. So if you know your stuff, you play rook takes c4, exclamation point. Okay. After king e3, then came queen c5 check. King d2, something new, and then this time king takes g7. Here, white's not so greedy. He's willing to settle for just collecting an exchange. But after pawn takes on c4, we have a classic example again of material. White has 1 point material advantage, a rook for only a bishop and a pawn, versus king safety. White also has a king floating around in the middle of the board. Let's take a look and see what happened. And keep in mind, white is a 25-25 grandmaster. Well, queen e1, trying to activate the queen, get off the file. Then came queen g5 check. King c3. Queen f6 check. King c2. Bishop f5 check. Gotta love that development with tempo. King c1. And now, what would you guys play for white? Okay, any thoughts, how to play for black to continue the attack, take advantage of the king while it's still exposed? In the game, black uncorked c3. Very nice. And sacrificing a pawn just to shatter the king position. Of course, if queen takes c3, rook c8, pin and win. JK suggested c3 to open the c file, and he's absolutely correct. So in the game, after the excellent c3, which JK suggests, b takes c3, and then rook c8. Now, from a relative value position, let's look at the black pieces. Rook developed, queen developed, bishop developed, king safe. These rooks still in the corner. Well, king b2, queen b6 check, king c1, and now here, white played queen a5. After queen a5, we can see all the pieces. Perfect harmony. King b2, queen b5 check, king c1, and this time queen up to b4. 28 moves. Grandmaster playing white in the alleged very safe, very solid Maroczy bind felt compelled to resign. We can see the c3 pawn is going to collapse, and with that, the white king is going to be hopelessly exposed. Now, another game that I found where a white FIDE rated player rated 2405 was Albert Blees. About 6 years later in the Netherlands, 1996, after rook e4, well, it's either king f2 or king to d3. Blees, playing white, was playing Tim Remmel, and after rook e4 check, played king to d3. Okay, so JK makes the comment that passive pieces do not count. He's right. When you're adding up force and you're talking about the force in a position, that's different from material. Passive pieces, undeveloped, that are not in the sector that's under attack, absolutely do not count for the defense. So here, rook takes c4, king e3, queen c5 check, king d2 was played in this game, and then king takes g7, bishop takes c4, pawn takes on c4, and queen e2. Well, black played bishop f5, and here white played a little more carefully with queen e3, offering to trade queens. After rook d8 check, king e2, queen b5, threatening the pawn on b2. White played queen c3 check, f6, rook at a to d1, offering to trade, bishop d3 check, king f2, queen c5 check. Now, of course, here king e1 would be a disaster because queen e3 mate, but white played a little more delicately with king to g3. And after queen g5, king f2, the players agreed to a draw. So there you have it. About 6 games total. Black won 4 in crushing fashion. 1 he overextended and wound up losing from what was pretty equal position. And 1 game ended in a draw with perpetual check. So pretty much to summarize, I think when we look at this variation, we can see that taking the pawn with 10, knight to b5, that's our Breyer variation. Queen takes, knight takes, queen back to d1, e5, 10, knight to b5, considered white's strongest continuation, castles, and then white would do well to play queen d2, play more solidly, continue his development, but taking this pawn with knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, is just a risky proposition for the white team because after queen check, king up, and rook e8, f3, black has a fantastic shot, d5. And after bishop takes, rook takes e4 check, and practice and experience has not been kind to the white team here. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us. I'm Grandmaster Ron W. Henley. You can log into ichess.net. I think they will post a link. They will probably post this on YouTube, and you can buy the Henley Master Method. I think the sale there is running for about another day, and good luck in all your chess endeavors. Thank you very much.